The mirror doesn't lie, even when the whole world does. You stare into its cold reflection and see not a man, but the ruin of a centuries-long experiment. Your jaw juts forward like a misplaced piece of bone, refusing to let your mouth close. Drool clings to the corners of your lips, sliding down the silk that no longer feels regal. Your tongue, too large and alien, swells inside your mouth like a beast that doesn't belong. Every bite you take is a small war. Your spine bends like a wilting reed, forcing your head into a permanent ball, not out of humility, but because your body no longer knows how to stand tall. 38 years old, but your frame bears the weight of 6 centuries of poisoned blood. Your eyes, those cursed Habsburg eyes, bulge wide and glassy, staring as if your soul is trying to escape the prison of your flesh. You are Charles II of Spain, and you are dying, not from blade or bullet, not from betrayal, but from a love so twisted it bore your undoing. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, brother to sister. A royal obsession with blood so pure it rotted. You know this. You feel the truth with the clarity that only the dying receive. You were born broken, not by fate, but by design. You cannot father children. You cannot govern a kingdom. You can barely read your own name without trembling. You are not a king. You are the final product of a dynasty that devoured itself in the name of divinity. You are the last breath of a dream gone mad, the living curse of a bloodline that believed itself untouchable. Part 1. Born of a real curse. This isn't a fairy tale. There is no wicked sorcerer, no poisoned spindle, no enchanted mirror whispering doom. And yet, there is a curse so vast it stretched across centuries. A curse so silent it was mistaken for tradition. So methodical it was confused with order. So deadly that entire empires collapsed beneath its weight. And the most terrifying part? This curse was not born in shadow. It was born in palaces. In rooms lined with gold and candlelight, kings and queens crafted it with careful, deliberate hands. They didn't summon demons. They summoned priests. They summoned marriage contracts. And they summoned bloodlines so tightly woven they began to strangle. In 1516, the House of Habsburg took the Spanish throne. They did not conquer it with war. They inherited it with signatures and sealed letters. From that moment on, Spain belonged to a family that believed one thing above all. Blood must remain pure, not pure of sin, not pure of evil, but pure of outsiders. They believed their veins carried something divine, and like holy relics, those veins had to be protected, sheltered, sealed, even if it meant marrying their own flesh. And so, for the next 200 years, the Habsburgs turned royal lineage into a prison. Of the 11 royal marriages made between 1450 and 1661, 9 were between blood relatives. Uncles married nieces, cousins wed cousins. In some cases, the same great-grandparents appeared on both sides of the family tree, again and again and again. And what began as a strategy to preserve power slowly became an obsession, an identity, a dogma. To them, this was not cruelty. It was destiny. They called it divine right. They believed that to mix their blood with that of common stock was not only politically dangerous, it was spiritually offensive. Marrying outsiders was seen not as a betrayal of love, but a betrayal of God. But while they dreamed of heaven, Their children were falling apart. The jawlines became longer, the tongues larger, the eyes more distant, the minds slower, the spines weaker, the souls quieter. Each generation bore deeper cracks in the mirror, and the people around them watched, servants, scribes, priests, and said nothing. Or worse, they said the wrong things. They said, "He is sacred." They said, "This is God's will." They said, "The blood remains untouched." But in truth, it was rotting. This is not a fantasy. This is recorded history. And it did not happen in secret. It happened in portraits that still hang in museums, in letters kept in royal archives, in tombs carved for kings who never should have been born. And it all led to one final figure, a man who could barely chew, barely walk, barely rule, barely exist. Charles II, the last Habsburg of Spain. He was not a failed king. He was a symptom. The final cry of a bloodline that mistook incest for immortality. The final result of a curse they chose to cast upon themselves. This is the curse that opens our story, not one of witches, but of pride, of fear, of lineage worshipped more than life itself. And it is real, brutally real, because history doesn't need dragons to burn kingdoms. Sometimes it only takes a family too afraid to marry strangers. Part 2. The legacy of those who called themselves gods. They were not content to rule. They wanted to be more. They declared themselves chosen, anointed, holy, not just kings, but gods in flesh. And like gods, they rejected impurity. Not impurity of thought or of action, but of blood. The Spanish Habsburgs believed that their lineage was ordained by heaven. Their DNA was not biology, but divinity. Their deformities, signs of holiness. Their mental decline, proof of their sacred burden. They were wrong, so very tragically wrong. It began with Charles I of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who inherited an empire so vast the sun famously never set upon it. But the cracks were already forming. Italian diplomats described him as having a long, cadaverous face, a mouth that hung open when unguarded. The infamous Habsburg jaw, protruding, unbalanced, first emerged here. He married his cousin, Isabella of Portugal, even though he could have chosen a bride from any court in Europe. Why? Because her blood matched his. Because her pedigree traced back to the same sacred rot. They called it union. It was, in truth, compounding damage. Their son would be Philip, a man whose reign would burn with faith and freeze with fear. Philip II was brilliant but brittle. He ruled not just with a crown, but with a crucifix gripped in white knuckles. He believed himself a guardian of Catholicism. But more than faith, he was ruled by rigidity, a brain that clung to control the way a drowning man clings to breath. He read and rewrote royal documents obsessively. He spent hours perfecting a single phrase. He trusted no one except his own bloodline. So he married 4 times. 3 wives were relatives. His 4th wife, his niece, she was the daughter of his own brother. And from that union came Philip III, a king by title, but not by nature. He was physically frail, mentally dulled, a puppet in royal robes. His mouth hung open constantly. He drooled. He could not chew. His speech was slurred, nearly unintelligible. But worse than the body was the mind. He was described as having the understanding of a child. He feared omens, believed in signs, spent hours in prayer hoping angels would govern in his place. The real rulers were his advisors, those who whispered in his ear while the empire fell apart. Under Philip III, Spain suffered bankruptcy after bankruptcy. The empire, once a sun that never set, began to flicker. Then came Philip IV. He reigned for 44 years, and yet history remembers him not as a statesman, but as a man swallowed whole by melancholy. Paintings of him show the worst of the Habsburg face: elongated jaw, vacant eyes, lips lost behind a chin too large. But the true deformity was within. He would disappear for weeks, refuse visitors, talk to portraits, accuse his courtiers of betrayal even when they had done nothing. He married his niece again, repeating the pattern as if the universe would change its answer if the question was asked enough times. From that union came Charles II, the end of the spiral. A boy born not to rule, but to suffer, not a king, but a relic, not a man, but a mirror, reflecting the consequences of every decision made before him. This was not royalty. It was ritualized collapse, a machine fueled by doctrine, powered by incest, and disguised as destiny. These men believed they were gods, but gods do not die drooling, shaking, and childless. Gods do not bury every son they create. Gods do not sit on thrones wondering where they are. They were not gods. They were victims of an idea so powerful it crushed them in its grip. Their legacy is not gold or empire or glory. It is silence in the nursery. It is tremors in the hand. It is bones that won't grow straight. It is voices that slur prayers no one answers. And in Charles II, the echo of all their sins stood upright. Barely. Part 3. The Curse Beyond Spain. Spain was not alone. The curse of blood did not stop at the Pyrenees. It slithered far beyond, to the golden sands of the Nile, to temples carved in stone, to thrones where kings sat not as mortals, but as living gods. Long before the Habsburgs deformed their dynasty with cousin marriages, the pharaohs of Egypt had already perfected the art of self-destruction. In their world, the royal womb was sacred. Only a sister could birth a god. Only the purest blood, unbroken, undiluted, could rule the two lands. And so they married brother to sister again and again, for generations uncounted. One such god-king was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the one who abandoned Egypt's pantheon for a single sun god, Aten. His statues remain strange and haunting, a man with an elongated skull, wide hips, swollen belly, breasts like a woman, and limbs too thin for his frame. His face was alien, divine, they said. Diseased, we now understand. Akhenaten likely suffered from rare genetic syndromes, his deformities a mirror of incest compounded over centuries. And his children? More broken still. His son, Tutankhamun, became king as a boy, but not a healthy one. He had a clubfoot, a twisted spine, a cleft palate. He walked with a cane, one of over 100 found in his tomb. He died before 20, leaving behind 2 stillborn daughters. His wife was also his half-sister. Even the gods could not escape the cost of blood made stagnant. Then came the Ptolemies, Greek conquerors who embraced Egypt's customs with fatal enthusiasm. They made sibling marriage their royal policy, not out of love nor lust, but ambition. If no outsider married in, no outsider could take power. The throne would remain closed, pure, sacred, and doomed. By the time of Ptolemy VIII, the dynasty was bloated, literally. Obese, goitered, bulging-eyed kings waddled through marble halls, their minds clouded by rage and paranoia. They executed scholars, murdered rivals, married sisters and nieces, and sometimes both. And finally came Cleopatra, the last of them. History remembers her as seduction incarnate. But her body bore the marks of her lineage: the round face, the hooked nose, the heavy build, echoes of metabolic disorders passed down through a line of incestuous unions. She married both her brothers. They both died. And when she turned to Rome, to Caesar and Antony, it wasn't just for power. It was for new blood. Her children with Roman fathers were an attempt to escape the curse. But it was too late. With Cleopatra's suicide, the Ptolemaic line ended. The incestuous dream of divine blood died with her. Egypt passed into Roman hands, and the gods were buried beneath marble and sand. The curse, then, was never uniquely Spanish. It was a human impulse, cloaked in divinity, driven by fear, polished by pride. To keep power at any cost, to guard the blood until it turned black, to protect the throne until the body could no longer hold it. And everywhere it appeared, Spain, Egypt, Greece, it ended the same way, with silence, with tombs, with children who never had a chance to live. Part 4. Science explains the curse. For centuries, they called it witchcraft. They lit candles, burned incense, sprinkled holy water. When a child was born twisted or silent or still, they prayed harder. When a prince could not speak, they blamed demons. When a king could not father an heir, they whispered of spirits or sin or Satan. But the devil was not in the shadows. He was in the blood. It was not sorcery. It was science, unseen, unspoken, and all too real. Today, we know the words: genetic drift, homozygosity, autosomal recessive inheritance. Back then, they had only intuition, and they ignored it, because superstition is easier than self-awareness, because admitting the truth meant admitting guilt. The truth is this: inbreeding is a slow death with a royal crown. When two people who share common ancestors have children, their child has a higher chance of inheriting the same faulty gene from both sides. These are the recessive genes, the ones that lurk quietly in healthy people, waiting. When they meet, they activate, and they do not forgive. The first symptoms are often invisible: slight clumsiness, shyness mistaken for piety, a mild limp, a weak cry, a baby that takes too long to speak. But generation after generation, the damage compounds. The genes fold inward, tighter and tighter, like a spiral staircase collapsing into itself, until at the bottom stands someone like Charles II. His inbreeding coefficient, 0.254. To the untrained ear, that number means little, but to a geneticist, it is a scream. A coefficient of 0.25 is the genetic equivalent of a child born to a brother and sister. Charles, then, was not just born of incest. He was the final product of 16 generations of it, and his body told the whole story. A jaw so oversized he couldn't close his mouth, a tongue too thick to pronounce his own name, a spine so malformed he leaned forward like a dying tree, testicles too small, sperm too few, a brain clouded by confusion, slow thought, shallow memory. And still, they tried to breed him. Still, They dressed him in velvet and placed a crown on his head, like wrapping silk around a wound and calling it holy. The tragedy is not just what they suffered, it's that they saw it coming and they kept going anyway. Royal physicians recorded everything. They knew the babies kept dying. They knew the kings kept getting weaker. They saw the jaws, the eyes, the twisted limbs. They performed autopsies. They wrote warnings. But tradition was louder than truth, and power is a stubborn disease. In Egypt, it was the same story. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, showed identical signs: elongated skulls, skeletal deformities, hormonal imbalances, infertility. Tutankhamun's DNA revealed the truth. He was the child of siblings. He married his half-sister. Their children, born dead. Akhenaten's strange form, long face, wide hips, distended belly, was likely the result of hormonal syndromes triggered by inbreeding. His religious revolution, his madness, perhaps even his vision of a single god, may have come from neurological disorders tied to genetic collapse. And the Ptolemies, a dynasty so obsessed with sibling marriage that they forgot how to live. Ptolemy VIII, morbidly obese, bulging eyes, goiter swelling his throat, was not fat with glory, but sick with imbalance. He ruled in paranoia, in bursts of violence, in cruelty fueled by mental instability. Coins minted in his time show not majesty, but disease cast in bronze. Inbreeding doesn't just twist the body, it shrinks the soul. The mind narrows. The immune system weakens. The spirit dims beneath the weight of inherited suffering. Many of these royal children were born already doomed, but still they were crowned. Still they were paraded. Still they were used. Because the system wasn't built to protect them. It was built to use them until they broke. And so we return to the mirror. Not the one Charles II stared into, but the one we hold up to history. This was not a failure of genetics. It was a failure of compassion. A system that chose divine blood over human life. That chose legacy over love. That chose to keep the bloodline pure, even as it rotted from within. Science explains the curse, but it does not excuse the choice to ignore it. And if we don't learn, if we cling to old myths of purity and superiority and chosen blood, then perhaps the curse was never in the genes. Perhaps it still lives in us. Part 5. The inheritance of pain. There was no applause when the last king of the Spanish Habsburgs died. No great procession, no glorious last words. Only silence. Charles II lay alone, his body a monument to everything his ancestors had refused to understand. A swollen tongue that never spoke clearly, legs that never walked straight, a wombless marriage bed, a kingdom waiting for an heir that would never come. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, as if sorcery could explain the wreckage of his flesh. But the truth was simpler, crueler. He was not cursed by magic, but by tradition. His death in 1700 was not the end of a life. It was the end of an idea. The fantasy that purity breeds strength, that blood is more important than breath, that divine right means divine immunity. Charles's life was suffering, but his death was a mirror. When he died, Europe erupted in war. But the real war, the quiet one, the old one, had raged for centuries, a war against nature, against genetics, against the simple, inescapable truth that life needs difference to survive. Charles was the last of his line, but he was never alone in his pain. In Egypt, Tutankhamun had limped through his short reign, hidden behind golden masks. His bones were riddled with disease, his blood thin, his heirs, stillborn, tiny, twisted. He was embalmed like a god, but lived like a ghost. Akhenaten, his father, reshaped a religion, perhaps because his body was too strange to be accepted as it was. His spine curved like a question mark, his limbs long and limp. He may have ruled like a prophet, but he suffered like a prisoner of his own genes. And Cleopatra, remembered as a temptress, was in truth a daughter of decay, the product of 8 generations of sibling marriage. She married her brothers, buried them, and then turned to outsiders not for lust, but for salvation. Her womb, too, bore the echo of damage. Her children were her last act of defiance against the blood that doomed her. These were not merely royals. They were hostages of history, trapped between crowns and chromosomes, asked to lead nations while their bodies crumbled beneath velvet robes, told they were divine while they bled out in silence. And we, centuries later, must ask, what is the value of a dynasty if its legacy is grief? What good is divine blood if it comes at the cost of breath, of love, of life? These men and women were not monsters. They were victims of a lie passed from a cradle to crown. That purity is power. That to mix is to fall. That to preserve is to ascend. But what they preserved was not glory. It was a slow suicide stretched across generations. The inheritance of pain is not genetic. It is cultural. It is taught. It is written into law, etched onto tombs, painted onto portraits. And if we are not careful, we pass it on, not in blood, but in belief. And yet, there is something sacred in their suffering, not because it was divine, but because it was real. It reminds us that even the mightiest palaces are built on human bone, that even kings can be broken, that the human spirit, however warped by blood or bound by lineage, still strives to live, to breathe, to matter. And in that, there is hope. So what now? Now we remember, not the thrones, not the wars, not the crowns made of iron and arrogance. We remember the boy king who needed a cane, the emperor who spoke in whispers, the queen who flinched at her husband's touch, the last Habsburg who couldn't eat a meal without choking, not because they were powerful, but because they were fragile and no one listened. Their pain is a story, a lesson, a mirror, and if we dare to look into it, we may finally break the curse. Not the curse in their blood, but the one in our thinking.